I'm sure there's something you have experienced at least once in a video game. You're wandering through the game's world, amazed by how beautiful and exciting it is, and you wish you could explore every nook and cranny to find out what it holds in store for you. Maybe you want to climb up that mountain or dive deeper into the forest right next to the pathway. And you just wish you could go there and explore that too, the game always dangling this idea of more right in front of you if you could just get over this wall or up that cliff. But you are not allowed that absolute freedom. You are simply not able to climb or jump over these barriers, or there are visible and invisible walls blocking your way, or texts popping up that tell you that you should probably turn around and that there isn't more to see here before you're forced to turn back. It's always a little disappointing. All of a sudden, you are harshly reminded that this is not a real world, but a game that has limitations. Those mountains and forests and everything, they are just empty models and flat textures, decorations slapped into the border of the game map, an illusion. I had thought it would always be like that in games, simply because it would probably be too much work to design a world with so much space to explore, and then to also fill that space in a meaningful way to make your time in it worthwhile. And even if such a game existed, you would probably never be given full freedom, because what kind of game developer would give you the ability to make ridiculously high jumps, or not punish overly carefree climbing with fall damage, or even give you the ability to fly, right? Xenoblade Chronicles X is a game released by Monolith Soft for the Wii U in 2015 and the successor to the first Xenoblade Chronicles, which is considered today as one of the best JRPGs of all time. However, the succession is only spiritual in nature, since the game's world, story and characters have no ties to the Wii original except for maybe a few Easter eggs or design homages. Defined by the X in the title, it's the odd one out in the Xenoblade series, where the other three main titles, Xenoblade 1, 2, and 3, are officially considered a more or less connected trilogy, reinforced by the numbers attached to their names. Aside from being an outlier due to it having been chained to the badly selling Wii U as the only console to play it on for the longest time, resulting in an abysmally low number of people who ever even played, let alone heard of it, X stands out for a few other reasons. First, the absence of a traditional Xenoblade protagonist, since this is the only game in the series where you design your own player avatar. And second, most notably, a main story that is pushed much further into the background. Instead of the story being the main aspect of the game, in Xenoblade X, it rather provides the framework for the world it takes place in, but it takes a bit of a backseat in favor of other aspects, especially the open world exploration. Many fans of the series have criticized the game for these reasons, and it is true that if you go into this game expecting a normal Xenoblade game, you will most likely end up disappointed. There are things that can be criticized about the main story of X, as well as quite a few other aspects, but it is not the goal of this essay to do that. In this video, I don't want to talk about what X does wrong, but instead what it does right, better than any of the other Xenoblade games. Better even than most open-world games in general, in my opinion. Because if you leave aside the prejudice and expectations of what a Xenoblade game should and shouldn't be like, Xenoblade Chronicles X will reward you with a gigantic, vibrant and fascinating world to discover all on your own terms, where you as the player have full control of where you want to go and when you want to do it. It is among my top 3 games of all time, and Planet Mira is, to me, to this day, the single most beautiful game world I know. But how exactly does the game do all these things right? To get to the bottom of this, let's start at the beginning and take a look at how X introduces you to its world. Also, the obligatory notice for spoilers. Since I'm focusing on world design and gameplay, I won't have to go into any story spoilers for X. But if you don't want to be spoiled on the regions and monsters that you are going to see, especially the ones one might encounter only a bit further into the game, this might not be the video for you. The story of X takes place on Mira, an alien planet that humanity crash-landed on after fleeing Earth's collateral destruction in an intergalactic war. You are woken up in a remote stasis pod by a woman named Elma, who, after realizing that your memory is impaired by the stasis, quickly briefs you on what has transpired on Earth. And yes, Cross, the player avatar, is an amnesiac. And even though the trope is a bit overused and a somewhat cheap way to make sure you can identify with a character, it does the job. You, as the player, know as much about the world as they do. You explore it together and learn alongside them. After creating your character, you take your first step into Mira. Elma hands you a weapon and you are taught the fundamental mechanics of combat. All the while, however, it is not really clear where exactly you are, since you start out in a rather secluded, rocky area, and in the dark and rainy conditions, it's hard to make out your surroundings. After a short while, maybe just around 15 minutes of playtime, you stop at a cliff. Finally, dawn breaks and the clouds dissipate, and Elma properly introduces you to the world while you are treated to a wide, sweeping shot of Primordia, the first continent of the game. And Xenoblade X makes sure that this first impression communicates what you have ahead of you, not only showing you the fantastic world with enormous arches and impossible rock formations, but also the giant, beautifully designed native wildlife that seems both awe-inspiring and terrifying at the same time. This scene, on a side note, also feels a bit like an homage to the establishing shot of the Gara Plains in Xenoblade 1, with the difference that X took that shot, multiplied it by 100, and elevated it to be part of the introduction of the entirety of the game, effectively setting the stage. And then, once the sequence ends, the game already presents you with a choice. How do you want to continue exploring? Elma gives you two options. Go left and take the safer route, or jump the cliff. Wait, jump the cliff? She assures you that you can handle the fall, but really? From this high up? When I first got to that point, I wasn't sure if the game might actually be playing a trick on me. I had already been surprised by the intense jumps you can perform here, especially after initially expecting a jumping height similar to that of Xenoblade 1, which is barely worth mentioning. And now it's being implied that on top of that, I will take no fall damage? I was so used to being punished by games for falling off from high places that I wasn't quite believing it. But I was curious, so I jumped and it was true. No damage. I safely landed on my feet on the beach below. I was so baffled by this, almost a little put off by how inherently unrealistic this felt. But that bafflement very quickly turned into excitement as the prospect of what possibilities this opened up to me. With those high jumps and no punishment for falling, I could go on all the most ridiculous climbing adventures, which was a thrilling thing to look forward to, especially with all the sights and structures around me that just asked to be conquered. On top of that, you later learn that there's an actual, believable, lore-related reason as to why you are able to perform these jumps without damage. So even my initial skepticism about the realism turned out to be unsubstantiated. The story then directs you towards New Los Angeles, the city that humanity has established in the 3 months since it arrived on Mira, where it introduces you to Blade, the military organization that is tasked with charting and exploring the planet, and killing hostile wildlife if necessary. After getting the quote-unquote paperwork done and becoming acquainted with the core gameplay functions and base premise of the story, you officially take up work at Blade, and then the game lets go of your hand completely. You can, of course, immediately take up the story and just follow along with that, but it is entirely optional as you are now free to go out there and explore every single continent. Planet Mira is at your fingertips. If this base structure of the prologue and core gameplay premise of Xenoblade X sounds somewhat familiar to you, that is because there is a game out there that followed closely after X and that makes use of pretty much the exact same features and structures. A game that has set a new standard for open world games. Of course I'm talking about Breath of the Wild. Link is woken up by Zelda's voice in the shrine in which his body has been preserved in a stasis-like sleep for 100 years. This long slumber has caused him amnesia, and he does not remember the events of the Great Calamity that had happened all those years ago. After acquiring a first tool in the form of the Sheikah Slate and learning the basic controls for running and climbing inside the shrine, you leave the cave and the game treats you to a wide, open shot of the outside world, after which you are free to choose which way to go, be it straight ahead down the slope, to the safe-looking path on the right, or even climb the wall behind you. Either way, you are now able to explore what is basically a huge tutorial area where you learn the basic mechanics of fighting and surviving in the wild, as well as the main functionality of the Sheikah Slate. Once you have cleared this path successfully, you are given absolute freedom to go anywhere you want. You can use the main story missions as a guide to the world, but there's no actual push to do so. You have complete agency over what to do and where to go, only being limited by your skill, gear, and stamina, which decides how far you can climb or glide with your paraglider. Breath of the Wild has been praised abundantly, and rightfully so, for its open-world design and exploration mechanics. The freedom of movement it hands to the player and the way it incentivizes them to explore the overworld on their own without the need to clutter the map with countless markers and icons, instead trusting in the player's curiosity to lead them to the cleverly placed points of interest all by themselves, makes Breath of the Wild a masterclass in open-world games. However, pretty much all of these amazing mechanics that would massively contribute to the success of Breath of the Wild had already been implemented by Xenoblade Chronicles X 2 years earlier, albeit going largely unnoticed in that game due to the lack of players and a lot of the game's critique having been directed at how much this game isn't Xenoblade 1. But after almost 10 years, opinions have shifted a little. More recent evaluations of the game have started to recognize the many strengths it possesses despite all of its flaws, and the general view on the game in the small but passionate fanbase has become only more positive over the years, as people started to value the game as its own thing that does not, with every breath, need to be compared to the numbered games of the Xenoblade series. Moreover, and I still cannot believe that I am saying this, with the upcoming definitive edition of the game that fans have been waiting for years, it can finally get the much needed quality of life updates it deserves and be made accessible to so many more people. With this, to hopefully get everyone even more excited to play it, new and old players alike, I want to examine how exactly Xenoblade X is absolutely worth your time by mastering open world design, exploration, and player agency. And I want to do that by looking at it in part through the lens of Breath of the Wild, because, like I mentioned, all these things that Breath of the Wild has been praised for, X had already done back in 2015. And yes, while it has been pretty much become an almost overused standard today to compare every open world game to Breath of the Wild, I can argue that it is nowhere more justified as with Xenoblade X, as Monolith Soft has been closely involved in the development of Breath of the Wild, and, as we shall see, probably was able to apply a huge part of the things they implemented and learned in Xenoblade X into the Zelda game that then would turn out to be extremely beloved. So, let's first take a look at what constitutes Breath of the Wild's excellent exploration. After completing the tutorial area, that is the Great Plateau, you are free to go wherever you like, only being limited by factors such as your stamina and your own experience. The game does not just drop you into an empty overworld, however. It makes sure that there's always something close by that catches your attention. Shrines, empty camps, NPCs to talk to, Korok seed puzzles, materials to collect, and animals to hunt. Aside from all these activities in your direct vicinity, the game never leaves you unsure about where to go next as you're traversing Hyrule, even when you're ignoring the story objectives. Aside from no lack of distinct and interesting looking landmarks, there's always at least one main goal in every area you are in, and that is to find the Sheikah Tower to unlock the region's map. Mostly these towers can be seen from afar, always giving you a clear goal in the distance that is worth heading towards. Some towers are easily accessible, while others pose more of a challenge due to difficult terrain or monsters guarding it. But no matter where you are, you always have somewhere or something to go to next. While this in of itself is already something not every game manages to pull off well, where Breath of the Wild stands out even more is by the tools that are given to the player with which they can explore, because they allow near full freedom of exploration. Most notably, Link is given the ability to perform nigh impossible climbing maneuvers to make sure you can conquer almost every structure you encounter. The game here sacrifices believability in favor of giving you more freedom, embracing the idea of, if you can see it, you can get there. In addition to that, you have several modes of transportation. You can go by foot, travel faster with your horse, or you can conveniently fast travel anywhere at any time. Next to Link's climbing ability, the other significant addition to the transportation/exploration tools is the ability to glide with the paraglider, which makes exploration even more fun and free. There really is nothing comparable to the feeling of conquering a very tall mountain or tower, and then being rewarded with the chance to take the leap and jump, and soaring off with the paraglider instead of just falling to your death. I had originally started the script before Tears of the Kingdom came out, so now I should of course mention that the Zonai tech in that game takes the free movement aspect a huge step further. However, as Breath of the Wild is the game that followed Xenoblade X more directly, I want to keep this discussion mostly focused on that still. In Breath of the Wild's Hyrule, you are also able to see extremely far into the distance, which is another big reason as to why traversing that world is so enjoyable. It is amazing to know that the mountain that you see in what must be kilometers away is still something that you will be able to get to eventually. That it is not just a textured JPEG, but an actual place with even more secrets and challenges to discover. And while the scale of the world is enormous, most of the time the exploration is, like the entire game, very quiet and personal. The camera stays rather close to Link. You hear the rustling of the grass, the clattering of your armor, you can go hunting and stealthing in the woods, the music just barely there to accompany your experience. You see the mushrooms and plants growing around you, you might spot small squirrels and birds' nests in the trees. In that way, Breath of the Wild's focus is closer to the survival aspect, where you are encouraged to be highly aware of your surroundings all the time, only leaving that perspective when you are on a high vantage point like a Sheikah Tower. And then there's the exploration in Xenoblade X. Exploring Planet Mira is nothing short of epic. The camera being able to zoom out extremely far to be able to take in all the gargantuan alien flora and fauna. Accompanied by the absolutely bombastic soundtrack by none other than Hiroyuki Sawano, who has delivered amazing and memorable instrumental and vocal tracks for this game, the overall presentation of X's world oozes grandeur at every step. Planet Mira is beautifully frightening and frighteningly beautiful, and it is worth experiencing down to every single area. And the way that the game organically leads the player through its world is pretty much the exact same as it would be implemented 2 years later in Breath of the Wild. In terms of the freedom of choice in regards to progressing the story, Xenoblade X almost takes it a step further than Breath of the Wild. While the latter game's story progression is connected to specific locations that you have to go to, with the story triggering once you enter said location, X confines the story into missions that you have to actively accept in your home base, meaning that you are 100% free to explore the entirety of Mira, all 5 continents, without ever accidentally stumbling into the story anywhere, unless you actively make a choice to do it. You are able to go as far as you like and wherever you like, the only limiting factors being, like in Zelda, the strength of your character, or rather, the level of the indigenous creatures you encounter that might hinder your progression. But not having a story marker to necessarily follow does not leave you without a goal on Mira either. Scattered around the world are smaller points of interest, like military base camps and objects like abandoned mechs or plant life that you can inspect for valuable materials, as well as the collectibles that are such a staple for Xenoblade games and that always offer you something to check out in your closest surroundings. On a larger scale, there's of course the fantastic world with a nearly endless amount of fascinating, alien-looking landmarks that you can see from a huge distance away and that beckon you to explore them. Like in Breath of the Wild, the ability to see that far into the distance is a great benefactor to how incentivized you feel to go out and discover things on your own. Some structures are so tall that you can even see them from across continents, like the huge ring structures in Oblivia or the giant organic glowing sphere in Sylvalum that you can both spot from the starting continent Primordia. This means that these landmarks are always looming over you, always beckoning you to see what's the deal with them, even if it sometimes takes hours upon hours to finally get there. It builds excitement and gives you something to look forward to, and finally reaching these locations is an extremely satisfying feeling of accomplishment. On top of that, Xenoblade X masters sense of scale like almost no other game out there, specifically because all of these huge structures are designed to be an actual traversable part of the world. They aren't illusionary objects to decorate the map, they are exactly as large as they appear to be. Like in Breath of the Wild, everything that you can't see, you can reach. And aside from all this, X also has an equivalent of the Sheikah Towers from Breath of the Wild that generally functions as the #1 goal to head towards while you are exploring. The data probes that, just like the towers, gradually unlock the game's map. The Sheikah Towers have been praised for actually getting this type of tower mechanic right, especially when compared to how some other games handle it. Where in a lot of games, unlocking the map means immediately getting bombarded with quest objectives and other information, and thereby rendering all exploration almost useless, Breath of the Wild provides you only with an overview of the terrain, and nothing else, meaning it doesn't take away your desire to explore that part of the map by overwhelming you with information that you could gather on your own. On top of that, the Sheikah Towers themselves provide some form of challenge by being guarded by monsters or other obstacles, meaning that conquering them is all the more rewarding. The data probes function in a similar way, with a few differences. The most obvious is that they are not towers to climb, but instead simple checkpoints that are mostly located on ground level. They do, however, also have their place in the game's lore and gameplay by literally being used for charting the unknown planet, as well as mining valuable materials in the soil that are needed for crafting. The other difference is that they do give you one piece of information about each part of the map, be that a mission that at some point takes place in the area or a unique enemy that you can encounter there, but it never tells you where to find it. This is enough to possibly make you curious to go and search for that thing, but not too much information so as to completely kill your interest in it. Plus, like the Sheikah Towers, some of the probes are difficult to reach while being guarded by high-level enemies, forcing you to sometimes find a way to sneak or fight your way to them, but rewarding you with a map overview and a fast travel point. On top of that, they fulfill their role as being notable points of interest by emitting a tall beam of light that, similar to the Sheikah Towers, makes them visible from far away and thereby give you a clear goal to head towards, even when you are not following any other quest objectives. So, Breath of the Wild and Xenoblade X both let their stories take a backseat in favor of giving the player an enormous amount of freedom of world exploration very early on, and they both balance the lack of story checkpoints by giving the player enough points of interest to instead incentivize them to go out and discover the world on their own terms, letting them basically choose their own adventures. These games do share a third significant exploration-related feature, however, and that is that they give you the, at least for open-world games, not very common ability to fly, or glide in case of Breath of the Wild, adding to the modes of transport already given. For each one, however, the developers chose a different point at which this ability is granted to the player. In Breath of the Wild, the paraglider is given to you pretty much at the beginning, with its functionality not really changing at all over the course of the game, except for maybe your increased stamina allowing you to glide for longer periods. This makes traveling extremely fun, but while it does allow for great freedom, it does not allow for full free flight, being limited by the height from which you jump off and, again, your stamina. Tears of the Kingdom, of course, took this a huge step further, but even there, the amount of batteries you have strictly limits your flight distance with the Zonai devices. The mechs in Xenoblade X, in contrast, eventually allow both complete freedom and full control of flight. Oh yes, X has mechs. And it's as amazing as it sounds. These skells, as they are called in-game, can be used in combat, with their weapon arsenal and even their colors being fully customizable, and are also extremely useful for traveling, since they are able to perform high jumps and can transform into vehicle mode, thereby allowing for extremely fast transportation. However, your first skell is only given to you about halfway through the story, and is at first not even required, but rather an option. And then, the flight module that allows the skell, as the name implies, to fly, is only unlocked sometime after that. This means that for a long time you have to get used to fighting and traveling on foot. You have to get used to being absolutely dwarfed by the massive landscape and its equally massive wildlife, as well as being painfully aware that, even with the high jumping and the lack of fall damage, there are some places that you simply can't reach. Especially because the game makes it clear to you that at one point you are supposed to reach them. There is the floating reef in Oblivia, which is, as the name implies, afloat hundreds of meters in mid-air, making it clear from the start that it will be impossible to reach without flight. Just like the entire northern section of Noctilum that is set out of reach atop a giant cliff, or the giant sphere in Silvalum, which has a noticeable opening with some kind of liquid pouring out, also hinting that there's something inside. The best example is the giant cliff in Primordia though, since at one point you will realize that you cannot complete the map around the area, because there's one data probe missing. I remember thinking at first that it could be hidden in a cave that I hadn't discovered yet, but after some time of pretty much turning over every stone in the area to the point of almost losing my mind, I realized that no, the damn thing must be on top of this enormous stone arch. And the only way to get up there is to fly. The game thereby indirectly made a promise that, at some point, I would be able to get there and discover what is atop of it. And that is an extremely exciting promise, and one that is definitely going to stick with players until the very point in the game when all of the build-up finally pays off and you finally acquire the flight module for your skell. This probe being placed on that huge structure just outside of New Los Angeles, the place from where you start your first flight, thus naturally making it the first point of interest most players will fly to anyway, and then combining it with the individual reward of finally unlocking that probe in general is just masterful game design. And the fact that by the time you reach that point you can be over 30 hours into the game, the exhilarating feeling of then being finally able to see Mira through entirely different eyes and literally having no boundaries placed upon you is absolutely amazing and something that pretty much no other game offers you in this way. The fact that Xenoblade X withholds this game-changing mechanic for such a long time is honestly crazy, as it is quite a bit of a gamble to have players wait for such a core aspect of your game, one that is advertised on the fucking game cover for so long. But Monolith Soft knew that the impact of finally getting your mech would be so much more rewarding for it, and I'm glad that they did it this way. It also adds a very unique form of pacing to the entirety of the game, one that is fittingly also tied to the central aspect of exploration. Aside from the story missions, X can also be divided into 3 main sections that correlate to the different modes of travel that are offered to the player. The first third of the game you're only able to go by foot, meaning, like I mentioned before, that the game makes sure that you feel really, really small and insignificant in comparison to the rest of the world. However, you can jump pretty high and also take no fall damage, meaning that the game not only doesn't punish you for going off any designated paths, but instead even encourages it, so there's already lots of areas that you can get to even this early on. Some places are still clearly inaccessible though, not just because you can't reach them, but also because your party is not strong enough to get past the enemies there. The game therefore eases players into its world by technically allowing access to the entire planet right from the start, but limiting it in some aspects, while at the same time promising that more options will open up at a later point. That point comes only after you've already spent a good amount of time in the game, however, meaning that when you finally get the mech, there has been ample time for building up excitement that then really pays off. Acquiring the skell opens up the second third of the game, where you suddenly not only have a powerful tool at your disposal that makes combat against higher level enemies a lot easier, but that also allows you to reach completely new places and travel around the world much faster. The skell can perform very big jumps, which allows access to a great number of bigger structures that were too tall to conquer on foot, and the vehicle mode lets you speed across the map extremely quickly. And with entering the skell comes a change in perspective as well, since a lot of the wildlife that looked extremely intimidating before due to its size starts to appear a lot less scary since you're now in a mech that's just as tall as them. So not only does the world open up more to you, but you are also able to see it through a somewhat different lens. But, again, some places, some creatures even, are still out of reach, even with your skell. And only after even more time has passed, again, it could be well over 30 hours of playtime, you are finally allowed to get to that long-awaited last third of the game, in which you are granted the absolute freedom of pretty much limitless flight. Technically, I can't say it's unlimited flight because your skell does have a fuel bar, but flying uses up so little fuel that this is basically a non-issue. This means that the game organically presents you with a new way of exploration for a third time now, which finally opens up the entirety of Mira, and I cannot overstate how great this payoff feels. Having the skell with the flight module truly makes Mira your oyster, and the game finally completely delivers on the promise of, if you can see it, you can reach it. And even if you have already discovered all 5 continents and have seen everything from below before, the flight module gives you a reason to revisit all of the continents all over again, since you then have the ability to finally discover what's hidden on all the floating islands and otherwise previously unreachable places. And with the game having this underlying gameplay structure, it manages to keep exploration engaging and exciting all throughout its playtime, even though Xenoblade X as an RPG is, per default, a very long game. The player gradually getting access to the skell, which, bit by bit, opens up the world to them, is a stroke of genius from Monolith Soft. It's bold, it's unique, and it's absolutely amazing. At this point, I should probably also mention the general fact that, with all the tools X hands you to explore its world, its map size is, like Breath of the Wild's, also ridiculously massive. To be fair, a huge chunk of the full map size of X is made up of ocean, but even that is not completely empty, since there are several small islands scattered around it. The cool thing about them is that they are, most of the time, not visible from the mainland and are not even marked on the map, even after you discover them. On some of them, you can even encounter unique monsters, tyrants, in this game, meaning that you could miss several unique enemies if you never venture out into the ocean. I can recall exactly one NPC who offhandedly mentions the existence of these islands, which is still very easy to miss. So unless you go out and explore on your own, you really could play the entire game without ever learning that these islands are even out there. Even with the huge map size, Planet Mira doesn't feel too large, however, which is a balance achieved by the speed with which you are able to traverse it. X allows you to sprint extremely fast for as long as you want, faster than in any of the other Xenoblade games, and in addition also gives you a mech that can either fly or transform into a speedy vehicle, meaning you can get from A to B super quickly, even without fast traveling. Another astounding thing that I haven't mentioned before is that there are 0 loading times in between the continents, meaning that you can run or fly across from the top of Noctilum all the way to the utmost eastern part of Oblivia and then all the way up to Cauldros without having to endure a single loading screen. And mind you, this game released on the Wii U, yet not even Xenoblade 3 was able to allow traversing across regions without loading times, at which I was, I might add, quite disappointed after being spoiled by X. There's also a bit of a learning curve with mastering both on-foot and skell movement. On foot it's all about learning when to sprint and make use of the higher leaps, or when to run slower and take advantage of the then more precise jumps. The handling of the skell is a bit tricky, since the turn radius of the vehicle form is quite large, but once you learn how to control it and also master the method of quickly transforming back and forth to nail the really sharp turns, skell movement is really damn satisfying and fun. There's also the change of perspective upon entering your skell, turning you basically into a taller character in a world that remains the same size as before, so everything feels smaller in comparison, making you feel more powerful in return. I have already discussed some of the most notable points which Breath of the Wild and Xenoblade X have in common, and already highlighted the skells as a feature that make X unique apart from other games. Now, I want to dive even deeper into some aspects in which, in my opinion, X especially stands out and even outshines Breath of the Wild and the other Xenoblade titles. Mostly, I want to talk about some specific features of its world design. While Xenoblade X's Mira is, at its core, based on many familiar concepts, it still manages to make its world feel fundamentally alien. Yes, Primordia is basically your everyday savanna, Noctilum is a jungle at its core, Oblivia a desert, and Cauldros a volcanic environment. But the way each of these regions is individually designed and filled with unique features truly makes them stand out. Also, Mira has 5 moons, so you know this is some good sci-fi stuff. There are the giant, gravity-defying stone arches and floating cliffs in Primordia and Oblivia. In Noctilum, there are the gargantuan plants and trees with strangely curling branches and roots, fungi taller than your mech, and plant life that comes alive with colorful light at night, not to mention the floating whale-like creatures that come out in the dark. There are the enormous abandoned alien tech ruins that define the landscape of Oblivia and especially Cauldros, with its huge floating drilling rigs and black and copper fortresses. And then there's Sylvalum, which is the single most well-designed alien landscape I have ever seen in any media ever, period. With its white ground and generally white, blue, and grey color scheme, it might look like a snowy landscape at first glance, but you soon realize that what you might have thought to be snow is, in fact, sand. Sylvalum is an alien, cold and white desert, covered in ghostly dandelion-like flowers and filled with shallow lakes, dark, weirdly organic-looking stone arches and huge fungus-like spherical plants that illuminate the landscape in an eerie green glow at night, completely transforming the feel of the continent with every change of daytime. Oh, it also has the best music. Even NLA, I'd argue, is so well designed for what it is. A generic American city on the inside, its appearance is disrupted by the fact that it is contained within the huge habitat unit that crash-landed on the planet, with the enormous spikes from the impact gel sticking out from underneath it from the outside. And yes, I want to argue that even the NLA music, that 99% of fans hate, serves its purpose masterfully. Just like an entire human city sticks out like a sore thumb in the wildlife of the alien planet it crash landed into, The music of NLA is so comically overstylized that it sticks out among the rest of the soundtrack just as much. Feel free to fight me on this in the comments. On top of the already wonderfully designed environment, the look of it can also fundamentally change with the unique weather effects, which are different for every single continent. There's so many, in fact, that they deserve their own little section, because just as much as Mira's world design stands out among other games, so do its weather effects. Planet Mira has, first of all, several basic weather cycles like clear and cloudy weather, rain, thunderstorms, rainbows, shooting stars, and even auroras that can occur on almost every continent. But it has several truly unique ones in store, with some even having an impact on your gameplay, like giving light buffs or debuffs to some stats, or outright having you take constant damage in the more extreme cases. For starters, there's the Energy Mist in Noctilum and Rising Energy Mist in Sylvalum respectively, both only occurring at night and both causing enemy mechs to not be able to detect sounds, which is helpful when you're doing some stealthy action, with the Rising Energy Mist in Sylvalum having the additional effect that it also refuels your skell. There are also two weather effects completely unique to Oblivia, the sandstorms and heatwaves, fittingly, with sandstorms lowering accuracy and attack on melee and ranged weapons because, well, obviously it's hard to see in a sandstorm. Similar effects apply to heatwaves, with the main difference being that they slightly boost thermal attacks. These effects are mostly a pretty minor thing, and especially on higher levels they are usually hardly more than an afterthought. But simply the fact that the game acknowledges that you are actually on an alien planet, and that the unusual and sometimes harsh weather conditions on such a planet are something that you have to keep in mind, and which can impact you while exploring, is a really nice touch. The weather having a somewhat meaningful impact on gameplay is, again, something that we can also find in Breath of the Wild, where the rain is infamous for heavily impairing your climbing ability, and cold and hot weather also being potentially dangerous if you're underprepared. I don't know to what extent Monolith Soft's involvement on the development on Breath of the Wild exactly impacted that game in the end, but it's not far off to think that details like the weather are also something that they brought in after they finished X. Back to the weather effects on Mira though, because there's still more. Another type of weather that I have only ever seen in X, and that I personally think looks super cool, are the electromagnetic storms that can occur both in Oblivia and Cauldros, and that are not to be underestimated when you're still on a lower level. Basically, EM storms are like thunderstorms, but the lightning-like bursts move from the ground upwards instead of the other way around. They look way cooler, and they hurt you. They will not immediately kill you, but they can make fighting in Oblivia and Cauldros more difficult during your earlier play hours. Also, another fun tidbit is that while usually skells do a good job at protecting you from harm, your skell itself also takes damage in an EM storm, because, yeah, of course, huge electromagnetic bursts are not gonna mix well with huge complicated machinery. Even more dangerous than the EM storms is the brimstone rain that can occur in Cauldros, and of course, you're in a volcanic region, so hot lava and brimstone raining from the sky and causing serious damage should be something to be expected. It may inconvenience you as a player, but it makes the world feel more believable and alive. Additionally, there are two more types of weather that are completely unique to Sylvalum, next to the Rising Energy Mist. While the usual color scheme of Sylvalum's environment at night is white, black, and green, on some nights, the sky is illuminated with a red, rare crimson aurora, turning the more subdued colors of Sylvalum into vibrant reds, purples, and magentas. It does, for some reason, also give you slight stat boosts, but mainly it really does just look fucking gorgeous. And finally, there are the spore clouds, extremely thick fog-like mists of spores, most likely meant to be a byproduct of all the fungi-like plants growing in Sylvalum, that reduce your sight to almost zero. If you get hit by the spores, enemies can pretty much jump scare you out of nowhere because of the poor sight, and the world around you feels claustrophobic, almost like you're underwater. Especially since Sylvalum is home to some extremely strong and mean enemy types, like the fast-patrolling Zedoms, running around while the spore clouds are occurring can be pretty intimidating, but all the more immersive. Lastly, the weather as well as the day and nighttime also have an influence on which types of enemies can appear in some cases. I am mentioning this only briefly, however, because while it is also a very quote-unquote realistic touch, it is not a feature that is unique to X, since most of the other titles in the series also have a similar mechanic. One of these weather-specific enemies I would still like to point out as an example though, because it is extremely sneaky and very likely to have caused many players to have one of those Xenoblade typical moments of suddenly the tyrant music starts playing and next thing you know you're running for your life. For this one, we're still staying in Sylvalum too. Lake Ciel, which is a very prominent shallow body of water in the southern region of the continent, is home to a type of extremely large and very strong four-legged creature called Ancient Coronid. They might look frightening, but they are more of the gentle giant type, meaning they won't bother you if you don't bother them. However, when the Crimson Aurora occurs, the Ancient Coronids turn into the more aggressive Frenzied Coronids, who will attack when you are in earshot of them. What is so mean about this is that this more dangerous variant looks pretty much exactly the same as the normal one, except for their glowing parts being a pink color instead of the usual blue. This means it is very easy to miss this change, which can result in the player crossing the lake assuming the giant creatures will leave them be as always, only to be attacked by them. Even worse, in addition to the Coronids now being more aggressive, among them also appears a level 88 Tyrant who can be, of course, just as easily overlooked, until Uncontrollable starts playing and you're getting one shot from above. It is moments like these that keep reminding you of the dangers of Mira, to always be on your guard when out in the wild, and to be aware of the effects the weather has on your surroundings. And with this, I have a nice segue into the next section, because I cannot talk about X's world design without mentioning how the wildlife of Mira is also wonderfully tied into it. This is the point where the game also stands out, even among the other Xenoblade titles, which absolutely do have some very amazing and creative creature designs, don't get me wrong. But the most obvious thing is that Xenoblade 1 to 3 do share a lot of their enemy types, which does make sense with them being more or less interconnected. But it also means that, in between all of them, there wasn't as much innovation or variety. In contrast to that, the size and looks of the wildlife on Mira are completely different from the rest of the series and are very fitting for an alien world. For example, a very common enemy type in the three mainline games that is usually found roaming around in the fields are wolves, written with the V and double F. They are mostly on the low-level side and look, as the name suggests, a lot like regular wolves, without ever having been subjected to many design changes in between games. And while there is of course absolutely nothing wrong with enemy designs being very close to real-world animals, I have to say that at least there is room for more. X also has a type of enemy that fulfills a similar role, that being common, wolf-inspired carnivores, usually more on the low-level end and usually found in fields. The design of these so-called Grexes, however, is very much different. They have more lizard-like qualities, with their sinewy, streamlined bodies not growing any fur or having any visible ears. Their head and backs are covered in armor-like plates, and their four eyes and dangerous scorpion-like tail make them look very distinct, and extremely cool in my opinion. There are several other enemy types in X that definitely lean on real-world animals, like the Simiuses that are very close to apes, the Diluses that look a lot like alligators, or the Millisaurs, which are definitely inspired by, you guessed it, dinosaurs. But with all of these, there's at least always one feature that makes them feel distinctly alien. The Simiuses have 4 arms instead of 2. The Diluses only have one prominent eye on their forehead and feature colorful fins on their back. And the Millisaurs, aside from the hammerhead shark-like head and the wings on their back, do have a surprise in store that I will come back to later. And then there's of course the huge variety of enemy types that I don't even know how to describe, like the aforementioned Coronids, Arcantors, Lepixes, Levitovs, Balaenas, and many more. It is not only the design, however, but also the presentation of the indigents and the way in which they are placed in the world that makes them feel like a believable part of a believable ecosystem. One of my favorite examples is a pack of Terebras, small weasel-like creatures with huge ears that is always found roaming around the fields of Primordia and following the footsteps of a Milosaur, most likely to benefit from the protection of the other, much larger creature. But that's just the beginning. Some indigents are going a step further and are using survival or hunting tactics that we know from actual animals on Earth, and I just love seeing them realized in the video game to make the world feel more rich. For starters, some indigents, successfully, remain completely still to disguise themselves as part of the plant life in order to prevail. There's the Tectinsulas and arena texts, turtle-like creatures that bury themselves halfway in the ground and that have plants growing on their shells, which creates a near-perfect camouflage. To the untrained eye, they are super hard to spot and can easily surprise new players who are out in the wild with too much carelessness. Other indigents are going a bit further still, with almost their entire bodies looking like the plants they are mimicking. Especially mean ones are the thaluses, which use a strategy similar to stick insects, and disguise themselves as branches, thus being able to easily get a sneak attack on you. Pretty much impossible to distinguish from their surroundings are the mortifolds and sacrifolds, which, when they lie in ambush, look exactly like regular flowers and will jump on you only once you get too close. These are things that you, as a human on an alien planet, will have to learn over time. It means you build up experience, and with that, as a player, you feel more invested in the world. You develop alongside your character from a mostly untrained rookie into an expert not only in combat, but also on Miran flora and fauna, and you know what to look out for in order to not have enemies take you by surprise as you grow your expertise. Mimicry and camouflage are not the only tactics you have to be prepared for, however. Other types of enemies are instead hiding in plain sight, so to say, but might lure you in with appearing dormant, like the Eviters and Silvalum, whose upper bodies visibly stick out of the ground and who might trick you into thinking that they are not even living beings with how completely still they are. An especially mean case of this kind of trap is Go-Ra, the guardian deity, that many players who know the game will remember. Due to its size and it being a machine-type creature, it looks much more like a piece of ancient mechanical ruins, and is therefore bound to lure in overly curious blades, only to give them the scare of their life once it starts to move, revealing itself to be an extremely strong tyrant. And then, with some indigents, you don't have any chance in spotting them beforehand, like the Sabulas, gigantic dune-like sandworms that just attack you from underground completely out of nowhere. The game is also very aware of the Dune parallel, as a pair of Sabula tyrants are called Atreides and Gesserit, referencing two important names from the Dune series. Finally, I also want to give a shout out to the extremely horror-esque looking Cantors that can sometimes be found frozen still, except for their heads moving and communicating with each other with odd clacking noises. This is something that serves no purpose from a gameplay perspective, but it is there regardless, and it makes these indigents feel, in their own way, real, because they are unknown creatures, so of course they are going to display weird and unknown behaviors. It's encounters like these, the weird, the sneaky, and the surprising ones, that are absolutely going to stick with you, and that make Mira feel like a believable, dangerous ecosystem, elevating the whole gameplay experience to something truly memorable. If all of that wasn't enough, there's an entire enemy index in the game listing every type of indigent and giving a rather long, in-depth description of their behavior and their biology, and it is simply there to just further enhance the world building. This is also something no other Xenoblade has, by the way. While Xenoblade 1 has the Collectopedia that lists the collectibles with some cute little tidbits about them and at least small one-liners about all the enemy materials, the other games don't even have an in-depth collectible index like that, and Xenoblade X has the index on top of a full Xenoblade 1-like Collectopedia. For example, did you know that those clacking noises that the aforementioned Cantors make are their way of coordinating group hunts, and also that they can reproduce asexually? Or that the Levitoffs fly because of a very light gas stored in their torso and therefore spend their entire life airborne, including giving birth? Again, this serves no gameplay purpose, but it gives you the option to learn more about the wildlife if you so desire, and it shows just how much care and love the devs put into designing the Miran fauna. And then, On top of all this work that was already put into designing the creatures and presenting them in believable ways, X introduced a completely new and extremely cool gameplay mechanic that was also, for some reason, never utilized again in 2 and 3. In X, during combat, you can target individual appendages of each type of indigen and destroy them piece by piece, which serves 2 functions. The first one is that sometimes some enemies' attacks are linked to certain body parts, meaning that you can neutralize these attacks by destroying the corresponding appendage. For example, you can destroy the tails of Grexes and can therefore rid them of the ability to attack with said body part, meaning that this is a very realistic and honestly genius mechanic that can influence your success in battle. The second function of this mechanic is that a lot of rare material drops can only be acquired after destroying certain body parts of enemies, sometimes even 2 parts on top of each other when you want to get to the really rare stuff. This is not only an honestly ingenious but also very believable system, as most animals obviously don't just have their valuable parts fall off them when they die. Sometimes you're even in for a surprise when destroying appendages, and this is the point where I finally want to come back to the Milosaurs that I already mentioned a while ago. Because these giant creatures, upon destroying their long necks, reveal that their head and neck were basically some form of decoy body part, with the true head being attached directly to the body. At a later point, you can even encounter one lonely Milosaur tyrant, Gradivus, the Headless Emperor, all the way alone in Oblivia, whose lore, yes, there's tyrants in the game that have their own lore, states that, quote, "This Milosaur is infected with a parasite that makes it both hungry and angry. Territorial brawls have long since ruined the regenerative ability of its false head." And wouldn't you know, when you're fighting this tyrant, there are actually parasites that drop from its body, which in turn changes the elemental attribute of one of Gradivus' attacks. And that's not even the only tyrant in the game that has this kind of connection between its lore and gameplay. The rest you'll have to discover for yourself, though. So, with all that being said, I think it should be clear that with Xenoblade Chronicles X, Monolith Soft truly created a masterfully designed and wonderfully realized world that is endlessly rewarding when you take the time to embrace it. The beautiful design of Mira and its wildlife, the different tools and the freedom you are granted to explore said planet, and the way it all ties in together with different gameplay mechanics really is the thing that elevates Xenoblade X above the competition. Also, do I have to say again that X was developed for the Wii U? A console whose hardware was outdated pretty much as soon as it was released. And it got a game this gorgeous and big on it, and one that runs smoothly on top. Monolith Soft really knows how to work with limited hardware and still make a gorgeous looking experience, because they understood the importance of art direction. Still, like I mentioned in the beginning, the initial reception of Xenoblade X started out mixed. Most of it stemmed from the simple disappointment a lot of players had because it's so very different from the first game, which is understandable to a degree. However, judging it that way keeps you from enjoying the game for what it actually is. Not a linear story that the game holds your hand throughout, but a truly open world in the purest sense of the word. I don't need to convince any of the old players who already love it to pick it up again for the Switch. But for everybody who might have started out on the wrong foot with the game, or who's never experienced it at all, go play it. You will not be disappointed, I promise. Let go with the preconception of what a Xenoblade game should be like. Play the side quests because holy shit, there are so many good stories in X. And, most of all, go out there and have fun. If you take up the offer of agency that X hands you, if you simply let loose and get to know the world on your own terms, explore Planet Mira with all its fascinating creatures, the diverse and awe-inspiring landscapes and outstanding world design, this is when Xenoblade Chronicles X truly shines.